Hello, this is the second part of the lecture in the fourth week of international trade. And I would like to discuss with you now Metzler's paradox. What is Metzler's paradox? Well, this is a narrative, this is a story about what might happen if the export supply curve of a foreign country is backward bending. That is, it does not have the normal form that we know. Yes, just a negatively sloped uh, curve. Now it's backward bending, and this is the way that has been chosen to represent uh, what Metzler's paradox is about. So Metzler's condition says a tariff increases the domestic price of the imported good if and only if the price elasticity of foreign import demand exceeds the domestic marginal propensity to spend on the export good. Well, what does that mean? In this case, the tariff does not increase the domestic price, it lowers it. It lowers the price of the imported good relative to the free trade equilibrium. Well, if the domestic price is lower and there is an import competing industry, of course, this industry will reduce its production. Yes. And of course, as a consequence, it might release labor and capital, both production factors active in the industry. So as a consequence, domestic producers lose while the only ones who are gaining are the consumers. Yes, they have a lower price and they can buy more. Contrary to the Stolper-Samuelson theorem for a small country, the return to the production factor used intensively in the production of this good falls too. So again, we have the introduction of a tariff, and we have a tariff that lowers the domestic price instead of increasing it. And then we have a consequence that the import competing production, the domestic market, has a loss, suffers a loss, and as a consequence of this loss, reduces production and releases labor and capital. So this is something that we observe in the real world in countries that are very much engaged in import substitution policies. For example, in a number of developing countries, for example, in Latin America. We have not yet been able to confirm empirically to find a country where everything behaves exactly just like Metzler has described it. But we know that it happens, and we are not yet able to explain it very, very, very well. But so the idea is to stick to Metzler's paradox to see if we have been representing it correctly using a backward bending supply curve, or if we need to represent it in a different way so that it complies with empirical results. Now we come to another aspect of international trade theory that is also important when we think about trade policy: the optimum tariff. Tariffs may raise welfare of a large country through an improvement of its terms of trade. This welfare gain however, has to be compared to the loss arising from the distortion of prices. Yes, when you introduce a tariff, then you create a wedge between the domestic price and the world price. So we have offsetting effects on welfare here. The optimum tariff lemma or theorem tells us that there exists a tariff that would just balance these gains and losses at the margin and hence maximize the welfare of the tariff imposing country. And we also assume that we're dealing with a large country that has an influence on world prices. This tariff is inversely related to the elasticity of foreign export supply. So this means that even in theory, it is possible to find situations where large countries can experience an advantage from introducing a tariff. The situation is totally different in the case of a small country. Yes, a small country only maximizes its welfare if tau is equal to 0. Yes, so if there are no tariffs. This is important to know. Import tariffs versus export subsidies. As you know, we have a large box with a number of measures, trade policy measures, and now we have to take a look at some of these instruments. Home market. A tariff on an import good gives domestic producers of the same good, domestic producers of import competing good, a real advantage over foreign producers, right? An export subsidy gives domestic exporters an advantage over foreign producers in foreign markets. However, it reduces the welfare of the subsidizing country by deteriorating its terms of trade and spending funds from the budget. A foreign export subsidy improves the terms of trade of the importing country and increases its welfare. But if this importing country decides to impose a countervailing duty, it would not only offset the importing country's welfare gain and possibly turning it into a loss, but also exclude this importing countries from the gain, from the potential gain. So when markets are perfectly competitive, export subsidies do not increase the welfare in the exporting country. They do increase it in the receiving country, in the importing country. There is also something like a symmetry of import and export taxes. We have the Lerner symmetry theorem telling us that a tax on exports has the same effect on domestic prices as an equal tariff on imports. So there is a certain symmetry in taxes. You know, tariffs are positive taxes on imports, and export taxes are positive taxes on exports. Subsidies are negative taxes. All welfare and resource allocation implications of tariffs also apply to export taxes. So please bear this in mind. And now we come to quantitative restrictions, which are also used extensively in the world economy and also tariffs are being used very frequently. Please take a look at figure 5.5 on page 144 of the prescribed reading, the effects of an import quota on welfare, the case of a large country. Targeting quantities instead of prices under perfect competition leads to the same outcomes. Quantitative restrictions can be explicit or implicit. The explicit ones appear in form of quotas, import or export quotas, implicit ones in form of domestic content requirements. While tariffs generate revenues for the government, QRs, quantitative restrictions, generate rents for those who hold the right to export or import the restricted good. And these rents may accrue to domestic or to foreign firms. In case they accrue to foreigners, then the income transfer adds to the efficiency cost of trade restrictions in the domestic economy. Now, figure 5.5 shows the positively sloped foreign export supply curve X2 star and the negatively sloped import demand curve lowercase m2 in the P times m2 plane. Both curves cross at point lowercase a. The initial free trade equilibrium at the world price lowercase pw. Now, if an import quota is introduced, imports are limited, say, to lowercase m over bar, which is less than the quantity that is being imported at point A, free trade equilibrium. The new equilibrium point is at lowercase b, with the new price being lower than the world price. The new price is PW apostrophe. Import demand becomes a vertical line between the points lowercase c and lowercase b. What we have learned is that an import quota lowers the world price. But at quantity m over bar, the domestic price that clears the import market is lowercase pd and not lowercase pw apostrophe. The same would have happened if a tariff would have been imposed. What are the distributional implications of an import quota? The welfare loss in terms of consumer surplus amounts to the areas capital A and capital B in figure 5.5. The areas capital A and capital C show the rent involved. If the rent accrues to domestic importers, the change in welfare equals the one under a tariff. So it's equal to the areas capital C minus the area capital B. The loss to the foreign country is capital C and the area capital C and capital D, and the welfare loss to the world is capital B and capital D. How do you administer import quotas? The government can choose between distributing the quotas on a first-come, first-served basis to firms applying, or through licensing. In distributing these quotas, well, actually, the government distributes the rents, right? It can do it on a first-come, first-served basis, then the rents or the quotas go to the early birds or to the firms preferred by the government. But the government can also do that through licensing. Licenses can be issued, again, on a first-come, first-served basis, see above. They can be licensed, they can be issued according to specific criteria, so firms have to comply with certain criteria to become eligible, or by an auction. Only in the case of an auction does the government receive the rent associated with the quota, like in the case of a tariff. So the government has a number of options, yes, to distribute these quotas and the rents associated. The problem with these distribution mechanisms is that they must not, they can open the door for corruption. And this we must bear in mind. The administration of export quotas is similar to import quotas, and we have the learner's symmetry condition to apply. There's always a tariff that can duplicate the price and the volume effect of an export or an import quota. Remember this, there is always a tariff that can duplicate the price and volume effect of an export or an import quota. Let us turn now to voluntary export restraints. What is that? It is an export quota to restrict the sales of a strategic good, maybe a natural resource, or a good embodying so-called sensitive technology. For example, the United States under Donald Trump, they wanted to restrict exports to China. And they wanted to restrict exports embodying sensitive technologies for the US, or what they perceived to be sensitive. And the Chinese responded with restricting the exports of natural resources, for example, rare earth, to the US. Voluntary export restraints are normally negotiated between an importing country and one or more supplier countries. This is the normal application. Yes, the trade war between the US and China is not a normal application, but it is one of the recent examples. In figure 5.5, the initial free trade equilibrium is located point lowercase a. With a voluntary export restraint limiting exports to lowercase m over bar, the falling supply curve becomes vertical at point lowercase b, a vertical line, with the new equilibrium point coming up at c, lowercase c. The world price of exports rises from lowercase pw to lowercase pd. The rise in the price with a voluntary export restraint is the opposite of what happens with an import quota. In case of an import quota, the prices fall. And if prices fall, this improves the terms of trade. A voluntary export restraint causes the terms of trade of the importing country to deteriorate. There is a loss in consumer surplus, which is represented in figure 5.a as areas capital A and capital B. Foreign exporters receive the price lowercase pd, but supply m over bar at the price of pw apostrophe, and thus enjoy a rent per unit exported. Total rents are shown in areas capital A and capital C. For importing countries, a voluntary export restraint is inferior to an import quota in welfare terms. In the export country, a voluntary export restraint reduces producer surplus by the area capital C and capital D, but generates rents of the area equal to the areas capital A and capital C, with the resulting bit benefit, the difference between capital A and capital D. Auctioning off licenses would capture rents capital A and capital C, although a voluntary export restraint leads to a decline in world welfare of capital B and capital D. Let us discuss now domestic content requirements. In the prescribed reading, you have figure 5.6 showing domestic content requirements. This figure of the domestic market for components in the plane price of components, quantity of components. There is a negatively sloped demand schedule capital D, two domestic supply lines lowercase q and lowercase q over bar, and the foreign export supply line x star. A domestic content requirement requires firms selling a final product in the domestic market to purchase a minimum amount of intermediate inputs from domestic suppliers. If they comply, import duties may be waived. If not, penalties can be imposed and the sale of the final product in the domestic market can be prohibited. The domestic content requirement can be imposed in physical terms or as a percentage of value added. Inputs of homogeneous quality, for example, oil, call for a physical domestic content requirements, and inputs of heterogeneous quality, like you need in different manufacturing industries, call for a value added DCR, domestic content requirement. The free trade equilibrium in figure 5.6 is E, lowercase e, with a domestic price equal to the world price. Domestic final good producers purchase the quantity of capital DO components at the world price, of which lowercase QO is supplied by domestic firms, and the difference between capital DO and QO is imported. Under the DCR, final good producers demand capital D over bar components at the price of the lowercase p over bar. Out of D over bar, a share of lambda times D over bar equal to Q1, with lambda a parameter between 0 and 1, must be bought from domestic suppliers. To supply lowercase q1, suppliers ask for the price of PD, which is why the domestic price rises from the world price to PD. As compared to a tariff, deadweight loss is represented by the area capital A. Consumption loss, the area capital B, is smaller under DCR than under a tariff. In case of a tariff, we have the three areas capital B, capital C, and capital E. Thus, since under a domestic content requirement the loss is lower than under a tariff, a domestic content requirement is superior to a tariff if the goal, very important, if the goal is to increase the domestic production of components. Let us turn now to non-tariff measures in general. All trade-related measures other than tariffs are denominated non-tariff measures. In the literature, it is common to find the term non-tariff barriers, NTBs, to denote exclusively protectionist measures. By choosing the concept of non-tariff measures, we want to underline that policies that facilitate trade without a protectionist intent should also be included in the NTM definition. The national organizations such as UNCTAD, OECD, and others have gathered information about NTMs and published papers dealing with the definition, measurement, and economic analysis of NTMs. Examples are papers by Deardorff and Stern, Measurement of NTBs, published by the OECD in 1997, then Jaime de Melo and Alessandro Nikita, NTM's Data and Quantification and Tools of Analysis, published by a French think tank. The economic analysis of NTMs involves the quantification, aiming at estimating what we call a tariff equivalent of an NTM, which of course makes sense because we do understand quite well the welfare and resource allocation effects of tariffs. And so by transforming NTFs into tariffs or into tariff equivalents, we are also able to analyze them using our analytical instruments, using the analytical instruments that we use for tariffs. NTMs include quantitative restrictions like quotas, domestic content requirements, and a long list of administrative and policy-related measures that have an impact on trade and welfare. There is, of course, sometimes with respect to specific measures, some degree of ambiguity. Why? Let me give you an example. In Sweden, for example, the imposition of windshield wipers on headlights of cars, though not directly discriminatory against foreign car producers, is often viewed by them as raising the costs, while the Swedish regulator claims that it is for safety under snowy conditions. Just to give you an example. In this slide, you have a list of non-tariff measures. We can divide them into technical measures, non-technical measures, and export measures. But it doesn't matter how you divide them. It's a very long list, so this is just a short version. Under technical measures, we have sanitary and phytosanitary measures. What is that? Those are measures related to agricultural exports, foodstuff exports. Yes. For example, if you want to export a good saying that it is organic, then you have to comply to a number of, yes. So if you want to export protein-rich goods, then you have to comply with a number of regulations that tell you how and when and how it has to be packaged and so on. So we also have technical barriers to trade. For example, technical standards that have to be complied with. For example, electrical products, electronic products, yes, they have to comply with those technical measures. Non-technical measures are pre-shipment inspection, contingent trade protective measures, non-automatic licensing, quantity control, price control. In some countries, the prices are controlled, and this is, of course, not very good for trade. Additional taxes, you have too, and charges, then the finance of trade, yes, for the finance of trade, there are certain regulations that also have a bearing on the trade, because someone has to pay for imports and for exports, and this if this is delayed because of regulations or some payments cannot be done as the producer expects it, then there are problems there. Then you have distribution restrictions, post-sale services restrictions. Subsidies are also an issue. Government procurement, sometimes foreign companies are excluded from government procurement. This is, of course, not acceptable. Intellectual property issues are also typical, and in regional integration areas, you have the rules of origin. They can also be very protectionist. Well, the empirical estimation of welfare effects of trade policy in economics, we do that using models of general equilibrium and models of partial equilibrium. Partial equilibrium approaches usually make use of econometric methods, and in the context of econometrics, you can, for example, estimate models that explain trade at a very low level of aggregation, many goods, and so on. This you cannot do with large general equilibrium methods, but with general equilibrium models, you can discuss changes in trade policy in a multi-country, multi-factor, multi-commodity setting, what you cannot do, of course, using simple econometric methods, yes, like regression or others. Well, what is the scope for further research? I think trade policy needs a lot of research done. There are many things that we already know, but what I discussed in relation to the Metzler's paradox, there's still things we don't know, we need to find out. So don't forget, trade policy is important for welfare, is important because it has an impact on factor incomes and on the distribution of income, as we learned from the Heckscher all-in Samuelson model. The improved availability of databases over the last decades have made it possible, yes, to take a closer look at the trade policy of developing and developed countries. We have to do that in order to identify opportunities as well as sources of distortions and losses. Thank you very much for your attention.